Mr. Hannan, what are the chances of a referendum win for the people wanting to get out of the European Union?
I don't know. The beauty of referendums is that we politicians don't get to decide. They are a very good mechanism for keeping the government under the control of the rest of the population. But I'm cautiously optimistic. In 1975, when we last voted on this, there was a lineup of forces whose imbalance is today barely imaginable. London Times calculated that the yes side had outspent the no side by at least 19-1. Every trade union, every business leader, every political party, and every newspaper except the Marxist daily, the Morning Star, was in favour of a yes vote. And that, in the end, translated into a 2-1 majority to stay in. None of those things will be true this time. Business is much more clearly divided. Financial services are becoming aware of the existential threat that Brussels regulation poses to London. There are mainstream politicians in all parties now who are prepared to speak out against it. But the big change is this. In 1975, Europe still looked prosperous. Today, it looks declining. In 1975, you could still argue that it was fundamentally an economic proposition. It was all about trading and getting together to stop another war. Nobody now can deny that it's a superstate in the making, with its own flag and its own parliament and its own currency and its own foreign policy, its own head of state and all the rest of it. With all those advantages, even so, in order to win in 1975, the Keep Britain in Europe campaign needed to neutralize what they rightly saw as their Achilles heel, which is the argument that we would be abandoning our closest friends. I was looking at the yes leaflet that was sent to every household during the referendum. Do you know the very first thing it said was not about trade or about peace or anything like that. The very first argument it made was, the old Commonwealth wants us to stay in. Followed by quotations from Gough Whitlam and the Canadian and New Zealand Prime Ministers of that time, who of course had reconciled themselves to the reality by then. The opinion of friends in this country will matter enormously in the run-up to our next referendum. Our Labour Party, which of course has very close links to your Labour Party, which explains a lot about both organisations, our Labour Party elicited an intervention from your former foreign minister a couple of years ago, where he said, it's very much in Australia's interest to have a fully involved and engaged Britain in the European Union. I can't believe that that was any more representative of public opinion in Australia than it was in the United Kingdom. I think we need to hear from our friends in this part of the world who think that there is life outside, that you can thrive as a common law English-speaking democracy, making your own laws and living under your own people in your own sovereign parliament. So I appeal particularly to the politicians and opinion formers in this room. Over the next couple of years, please do not be shy of, well, if you agree with me, obviously. If you don't agree with me, I don't want to hear from you at all. But if you're on our side, do not be shy about saying so. We really do welcome support. Intervention from Europe, that goes down badly because we regard them as proper foreigners. Intervention from here, that's family.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you very much for your presentation and your book, which I enjoyed enormously.
Brilliant question. Thank you very much.
I have a question for you about the monarchy. In your book, you mention that from the Glorious Revolution 300 years ago onwards, the Parliament is able to choose the king and limit the power of the king. My question is, what's the relevance of monarchy in a modern parliamentary democracy?
To be honest, and I know this is going to offend a lot of you, I just don't think it's very much. I think that the ties between your country and mine are not dependent on a shared head of state. They rest on so many shared assumptions, so many family ties, and an outlook, a common outlook that comes when you have shared institutions, that having a shared head of state is a nice expression. It's a nice cherry on the top, but it's really not fundamental to our relationship. For me, I'm enough of a Burkean conservative to think if we got rid of it now, we would make an absolute balls-up of whatever followed. I have absolute confidence in our political class to make the most almighty dog's breakfast of any attempted republic. You know, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Or as the third Viscount Falkland slightly more pompously put it, when it is not necessary to change, it is necessary not to change.
I was delighted to hear you say, Dan, that you welcomed our intervention in the UK affairs. And I would like to invite your intervention here. We have a law here called Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act. And this government has been elected partly on the promise to repeal that. And it is vital for our free speech that it is. Now, there is some talk that Senator Brandis, the Attorney General, is wobbling on whether to do that or not. And it's a crucial issue to us here. And if you could turn that gilded tongue of yours to address him on the subject, we would be very grateful. Could you say do you follow the issue at all?
Free speech has to be an absolute, right? We can't, as soon as you say free speech except, then you don't believe in it at all. This idea which has crept up on us in the last 20 years, in my country and in yours, that if you say something offensive enough, that ought not to be allowed, it's in a special category, that is absolutely irreconcilable with freedom of expression. We have perfectly good old common law protections against incitement and against defamation. If I were to say something about you that is both untrue and damaging to you, then you've always had the recourse of libel or slander. But this is something different. This is criminalizing opinions on behalf of purportedly offended groups. J.S. Mill put it brilliantly. If you have a clash of different ideas, different interpretations, then out of that din, out of that cacophony, comes the truth, because the good, true ideas drive out the bad, false ideas. As John Milton put it in 1644, opinion in good men is but knowledge in the making. What is today a fringe position, if it stands the market test of being able to go up against other ideas and prevails, becomes received opinion because it's fundamentally true. I'm not going to turn my silver tongue to this, but let me turn Jefferson's silver tongue to it, because I think he said this beautifully, and he could have been talking about Section 18C. He said, "It is only falsehood that needs the support of the government. Truth stands by itself."
Thank you very much. I wish we could record that and pass that on to Canberra.
Daniel, thanks once again for a marvellous and inspiring talk. Very good. I'd like to invite your reflections on UKIP, and because you sound to me remarkably more like a member of UKIP and less like a member of the Conservative Party. Is there some possibility of after the forthcoming elections, that there may well be some sort of a merger or an arrangement between the two parties?
Forward though I cannot see, I guess and fear, says the poet Burns. I don't know, but I do know this. If we cannot reach some kind of accommodation, then there is well, it's not no chance, there is a very, very small chance for my party to win the next election. UKIP doesn't have to get very many votes in a general election to put a majority beyond the reach of the Conservative Party. If we were all rational, calculating machines, if we were all unemotional computers, the two right-of-centre Eurosceptic parties would already have done a deal, because our voting system, unlike yours, ruthlessly penalises a split on one side or the other of the political spectrum. If Conservatives and UKIP candidates battle each other in marginal constituencies, then those seats will be won by Europhile Labour and Lib Dem MPs on a small share of the vote. What's holding it back? I'm sorry to say, personal rivalries, personal dislikes. But if, as a result of nothing more than animosity, we were to lose the chance of getting a referendum on leaving. And into the bargain, we were to toss the car keys of the wrecked, written-off car back to Balls and Miliband, the people who crashed it, so that they could empty our treasury and exhaust our credit all over again. If all that were to happen because people couldn't sit down and make a deal that it was in the interests of both parties, it would reflect badly on all concerned.
Daniel, could you please tell the audience the story that I remember you saying last year or a year ago when you were out? Forgive me if I'm mistaken, but you gave 3 wonderful things that Britain needed to do. Decouple, and you said 2 other things and I can't remember them. Do you remember?
This wasn't for Britain. This is my advice to the stricken countries in the Eurozone, that they should default, decouple, and devalue. We are inflicting preventable poverty on millions of people in the Mediterranean and other peripheral Eurozone states because the authors of the single currency can't bring themselves to admit their mistake. In order to save face, they are condemning people to preventable poverty. These must be the most expensive faces since Helen of Troy's. Hers was said to launch 1,000 ships. These are faces that are now causing millions to suffer the squalor of dependency and worklessness. We need a managed dismantling of the euro so that the stricken countries can price their way back into the market and start exporting their way to growth. That's not going to solve all their problems. I'm enough of an Austrian economist to think that devaluation is never the long-term answer, but it buys you the space you need to make the necessary reforms. It's why the United Kingdom, which kept its currency, is now growing economically, the fastest growing economy in the European Union, whereas Ireland has suffered in an almost unimaginable way, been exporting people in a way not seen for decades. That's what happens when you cede control of your monetary policy, and it shows the essential cruelty, the essential arrogance of the European project, that they won't allow this to make them question their fundamental assumption that giving more and more power to Brussels must carry on.
Daniel, thank you for your contribution. I enjoyed your historical allusions. Winston Churchill, together with your information that he planned the service with Roosevelt off Newfoundland on the Prince of Wales, also chose his own funeral service, and he included the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Last year, November the 19th, marked the 150th anniversary of Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, which along with his second inauguration address were described as America's greatest and second greatest sermons. The notion of freedom to which you've alluded, the freedom of the individual, is a very important one. And Lincoln spoke in his address of government of the people, by the people, for the people. But notably before that phrase, he had the words that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. In terms of your comment before in relation to the monarch of Australia, you, I think, had an indifferent view, although if it's broken, don't try and fix it. But the Queen stands as the head of the Church of England as well, and there is a view that it's not necessarily freedom alone that's created the prosperity of those countries established under British rule, but the role of the Judeo-Christian faith that's been exercised through that process. And as a final postscript that I might add, Lieutenant Governor was sent to this colony through the influence of people such as William Wilberforce, his goal being to protect the Indigenous population of this state after the slaughter of Indigenous Australians in Tasmania. I'd welcome your comments, please.
Shall I tell you the most amazing thing about the Gettysburg Address? As you correctly say, that phrase, government of the people, for the people, by the people, has been repeatedly quoted as the supreme apologia for democracy. It's often quoted as proof of American exceptionalism. But those words that Lincoln spoke 150 years ago, lightheaded with an oncoming case of smallpox at the soldiers' cemetery in Gettysburg, were not his. His contemporary audience would have recognized their source as our generation typically does not. That phrase, government of the people, by the people, for the people, came from the prologue to what was probably the first translation of the Bible into English by John Wycliffe. And incredibly, those words were written in 1384. Now, in what other language could such a thought have been conceptualized and committed to paper in the 14th century? There is as fine a proof as you could ask of the nature of Anglo-Sphere exceptionalism. I'm a member of the Church of England, a bad and indifferent but occasional churchgoer in the Church of England. I don't believe that we need nationalization to make the thing work. It doesn't work in any other field of life. We all know as conservatives that state control is a hindrance to success. You know, the United States has managed to keep a level of church attendance that we have lost in the rest of the Anglo-Sphere precisely because it has competing denominations working according to market principles such as we understand everywhere else. So, do you know what? I could live with or without establishment. I could live with or without a monarch as supreme governor, but what I can't live without is freedom. That is the fundamental birthright of everyone in this room, and that's the thing that we should be prepared to fight for to the end.
Thank you. If you have a look at the war memorials in Melbourne, you'll see that they say, well, inscribed, strength in unity. Do you see a time in the near future where countries like Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the United Kingdom will act more cohesively and in a more united manner, as opposed to the current situation?
Thank you. Well, having brought back the free movement for Australian and New Zealand citizens, what I'd really like to do when we leave the European Union is to create an Anglo-Sphere free trade area. Just that. We've already got the military alliance, right? We've got as close a collaboration in terms of security as has ever existed among sovereign countries in the world. If nothing else, the whole Snowden and Five Eyes thing revealed the unthinking, familial proximity between the core Anglo-Sphere governments. Free trade, free movement of goods and services and capital and labor. That's all I'm asking for, right? Heaven knows I've had enough of common currencies and transnational parliaments and common passports and all the rest of it. I'm not after any kind of, Cecil Rhodes type imperial federation, just the free movement of goods and services. The rest we can leave to the close ties among our peoples. Here, I think, is the really interesting question. How far do you draw the borders? What do we mean by Anglo-Sphere? Okay, so the easy bit is US, Canada, Britain, Ireland, Australia, New Zealand, right? Everyone agrees with that. And most people would extend to Hong Kong and Singapore, common law, English-speaking, successful free economies. The democratic Caribbean states, maybe, arguably the English-speaking part of South Africa. But the elephant, and for once that metaphor is precisely apt, is India. Admit India, and that's 2/3 of the population. So, is India primarily an Asian superpower, or is India primarily an Anglo-Sphere democracy? I think, my friends, this is the single most important question of the 21st century. Geopolitics turns on it. If India self-identifies as one of us, as an English-speaking common law country, then the world looks an awful lot brighter and warmer. And I think the signs are good. The army doesn't interfere in politics there. The elections don't result in anyone being exiled or shot. The legal system is open to the individual seeking redress. It's not an instrument of state control. The days when India, like all newly independent countries, differentiated itself almost for the sake of it from the former colonial power, when it went down the road of Swadesh and Swareshi and autarky, keeping out exports and equidistance between Washington and Moscow and all the rest of it, those days are over. India feels and behaves much more as an English-speaking, democratic, Anglo-Sphere member. And I think one of perhaps the act for which George W. Bush deserves the most praise that he didn't receive at the time was that he successfully drew India back in to the alliance of English-speaking nations in the late 90s when he accepted their nuclear status. The Obama regime has been shamefully neglectful of that relationship, but I'm glad to say that the British and Australian governments have not. I follow Tony Abbott and Julie Bishop on Twitter. They're always on about India, and rightly so. It's the key relationship of our age. If we get that right, it's not certain, but if India continues down the path towards freedom, free enterprise and individualism, and thereby aligns with the other countries to which it's institutionally linked, then I think the future for the Anglo-Sphere and the world is a very warm one. We are perfectly well suited to a devolved network internet age as an individualist culture with strong democratic traditions.
I've got two questions, if I may. Alex Salmond and Scottish independence, what should we expect? And habeas corpus. Australian Julian Assange was under house arrest by the Cameron government without charge. So where was habeas corpus?
Okay. Well, on the SNP-inspired referendum, this is being recorded, so I could end up looking a complete fool if I give you a bad prediction. I think it'll be a substantial no vote. I think it'll be more than 60% in favour of the UK. For all of our occasional joshing, England and Scotland are kindred nations. We have the same sense of humour, the same character, the same morose, alcohol-abusing stubbornness, and we watch the same TV and we sing the same songs. There is not the usual criteria of separate nationality within. The River Tweed is a border that is more of happenstance than of ethnographics, if I can put it that way. So I'm delighted there is a referendum. Always and ever in favour of referendums. Will accept the result unhesitatingly either way, but my guess is that it will probably go in favour of the UK. Julian Assange is not under house arrest. Julian Assange might have been a lot better off had he served a prison term in Sweden, assuming he was convicted, from which he'd have been released years ago, and in the meantime he'd have had TV and, gym and all the rest of it. If you follow the actual chronology of events, I'm afraid it is impossible to sustain the idea that this is about a well-founded fear of deportation. That was how I approached it when I first heard about it. When I started looking at the thing, I'm afraid it became impossible to sustain that idea. And he's certainly not under house arrest from the UK government. We have a very small number of countries with whom we have extradition treaties. Does anyone seriously suppose that Sweden is not a country with a functioning legal system, with due process and a fair judiciary? So this is a problem of his making and a problem of Ecuador's making. And by the way, if there is any violation of sovereignty here, it's Ecuador intervening in a judicial process in another country in a straightforwardly political act, violating the sovereignty of the United Kingdom. Please divorce this legal case from all the questions of whether or not the WikiLeaks thing was right. They are two completely separate questions. This is a judicial process for somebody who is wanted by a friendly government and is refusing to face charges there. The United Kingdom would not be a responsible member of the Comity of Nations if it made a political decision to back a reasonably made judicial request.